All right. Let's do this again, shall we? Got a cup of joe, a nice tank Christmas sweater. I'm feeling the mood to talk about tanks. Oh, I haven't had hot cocoa in so long. Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the World Wide Web. My name is Ed320, and welcome back to another impromptu Edda rambles about tanks in the snow. As you can probably tell, this is going to become a recurring theme on this channel. I don't know if I expressly mentioned it last time, but I just love the snow. It is genuinely so beautiful and therapeutic to me. For those who don't know, since I'm posting this on the main channel, and maybe you're not on my Discord, which you should join my Discord, by the way, or follow me on Instagram, because I also give updates there. Actually, also join the subreddit if you haven't already. And also, thank you to the patrons. Shout out to the patrons. Remember to do that at the beginning of the video. Become a patron, you'll get videos early, you'll get extended lengths. The patrons are probably gonna get like the totally raw, uncut version of this, however long this ramble ends up being. I have been so focused on this next large-scale tank documentary about the Stuart that the upload schedule kind of falling off as a result. Things in my life generally are changing at a very rapid pace right now. It's sometimes hard to keep up the momentum and the inspiration and the excitement to work on videos, but literally, like, I woke up this morning and I was so unironically jolly to see all of this snow. It made me so happy that I was just like, I gotta do something. Kind of like it did last time. So I've been out here in the snow all day. The dump trucks are in full force today. Leave a like on this video if you've got a dump truck. And so, like last time, I want to do an impromptu ramble about tanks. Today I'm gonna talk about a topic of the US Army in the interwar period that maybe is a question that none of you really asked, but it's a question that I asked and then subsequently now have an answer to through all my research. And that question is, as the title of the video suggests, why didn't the United States make like any tanks in the 1920s and 30s? Well, early 30s, but you know what I mean. Again, it's probably not a question that any of you ever actually have, because I doubt there are very many people besides myself who really think about the United States during the interwar period, which I think is a shame, by the way, because it's a really fascinating time period and a really fascinating country within that time period. I would actually argue all countries are really interesting in the interwar, but right now, America, because for me it's the easiest stuff to research and it's the stuff that I know, there's a really interesting period there where the US just isn't doing anything with tanks. So, why? Well, to be honest, the simple answer is money. Money and honestly, interest. So, World War I, right? The United States enters World War I much later than everybody else and doesn't have tanks. Duh. So the US has to play catch up on what are tanks, what have they been used for, and how can we incorporate them into our army. Now, the US had been observing the usage of tanks since like 1916, since the British unveiled them, which also there's a whole other discussion to be had, honestly, about whether tanks were truly like this new groundbreaking invention. Honestly, the more research I do into it, the more I'm starting to realize that the tank kind of had multiple points of origin, and it was sort of just in the cultural zeitgeist of the time. The British were just the first people to actually send one to war and shoot at people with one. So by most accreditations, they are the first people to build tanks. But again, the concept, I mean, people go all the way back to Leonardo da Vinci and all that, but like even the United States in like 1914, 1915 is thinking about something like a tank. Especially during the American expeditions into Mexico and whatnot in 1916. All those guys were using armored cars, and they knew they were good. Tractors were becoming a thing. It was the age of the automobile. So the motorization of warfare was inevitable, and everyone was thinking about what is it going to look like. So the idea of taking Caterpillar tracks and strapping it onto an armored vehicle of some kind with guns and using them in war, again, honestly, like, it wasn't a British original idea, but the British were the first ones to actually do it. So, cheers. But the United States, honestly, even during and even a little after World War I, just never really found it all that applicable. So World War I, General Pershing goes overseas and he sees the French tanks, the Renault 1917s. And he says, we gotta have these, because he understands that for the war that they're fighting over in Europe, they are clearly really useful. He also procures British tanks from the Mark Vs and whatnot. At that point, it would have been the Mark Vs, Mark V Stars, stuff like that. Where he creates a tank corps of people to study tanks, figure out what they are and how we can use them in the army, and train people to use tanks, and then come back and basically establish a kind of tank school for the US Army. I forget the names of all the guys who are originally involved in that. I'll put it over here, but I know Patton is obviously one of the first guys to get involved in all that. And it's headed by, oh God, again, I forget the name of the guy, but the original tank corps is headed by this guy. I forget his name, I'm so sorry, but off the dome today. So that's the US tanks in World War I. We basically just used the French Renault tanks and we use the British Mark Vs. A lot of people will point to the M1917, which is obviously the American copy of the Renault, the FT. Those tanks began development in early 1918, and they took forever to develop. Famously, like, the conversion from metric to imperial was particularly difficult. And also, it was just the French methods of production did not fit the American method of production, like, at all. Like, they were both mass production, but done in different ways, because this was the early days of mass production where just stuff was just not standardized. So the Americans got the French tanks, and it wasn't just the imperial measurements that needed, the metrics to imperial that needed doing, which did take a long time, but also just generally, like, parts, just the shapes were non-regular, and it did not transition easily into American production. So the M1917, the American copy of the Renault, the licensed production version, took forever to get off the ground. And the first tanks didn't actually make it into Europe until like November 20th or something like that of 1918, which is obviously, 10, 11, 9 days after the end of the war. So the M1917, the American M1917 did not see combat during World War I. So all American tanks that we actually used in combat in the First World War were all borrowed British or French tanks. But we come out of World War I now with, a couple thousand M1917s and a couple other things like the Ford 3 tons and, the Mark 5s, the Internationals, the Mark 8s, right, the heavy tanks. Then comes 1920 and the establishment, or rather the introduction, of the National Defense Act of 1920, which you really can't talk about American tanks in the interwar period without bringing up the National Defense Act of 1920, because it's very important. It's usually brought up in a negative context because the big thing that everyone in the tank world really knows about it is it was the law that declared that, first of all, it abolished the tank corps, and then it assigned tanks to the infantry. And then that's what led to the cavalry not being allowed to have tanks, and the cavalry had to have combat cars, which many people, like, it's often brought up as like this, oh no, the cavalry couldn't have tanks. Like, what a silly, stupid decision. They had to split it into two different things. Like, what a dumb idea. Infantry get the tanks, like, blah, blah, blah. But especially at the time, it kind of did make sense. What people don't know is, like, what the National Defense Act of 1920 actually did. Like, it wasn't an entire law just about separating tanks from cavalry and infantry. It did a bunch of other things. What the National Defense Act of 1920 really was the U.S. looking back at what happened in World War I and saying, we were not ready for that at all. Like, industrially, training-wise, like, our military was not ready for this. Famously, if you guys ever hear of Syrian Arsenal, a fantastic firearms channel, I love them very much. They talk about a lot of World War I firearms, and if you watch the videos on the 1911 and the Springfield 1903, you will hear the stories of just how unprepared industrially the U.S. was for World War I. We had a severe shortage of small arms, of everything, of manpower, everything. Like, we entered the war in 1917 with jack diddly squat, and it took us forever to basically re-industrialize ourselves for that war. We were selling weapons hand over fist to everyone else during the war, but then when it came time for us to play, we had sold everything. We had nothing left for us. All of our industry was taken up building stuff for other people, like the Russians and the British and the French. The big thing that the National Defense Act of 1920 set out to do was, we're going to completely reorganize the military. It establishes the three branches of the Army, the National Guard, and the Army Reserves, which is pretty good. And it really focused on create a structure and a plan for industrialization, basically the ability for the military to much more easily go to civilian contractors and say, can you build us guns? Can you build us tanks? Can you build us planes? Whatever it is. That's what the National Defense Act of 1920, that's what it was all about. But then also in there is abolish the tank corps. By the way, a subtext to all of this, I highly recommend, for extra background on this era of American tank history, the Chieftain's 2-part video series on tank doctrine of the interwar period. He does a fantastic video series deep dive basically on this whole thing. So that's all fine and dandy, but then after 1920, what does the US think about tanks, and what are we prioritizing? Well, honestly, not much and not much. What they're focused on is on a territorial US conflict, because they don't want to get involved. We don't want to get involved in another European war ever again. Like, we come out of World War I being like, that sucked. We don't want to do that again. So, you know, we're not going to particularly plan for it. We're going to try to take just the overall lessons of warfare that have been learned from the First World War, like machine guns and artillery tactics and all that fun stuff. But in terms of like fighting in the trenches of Western France, like we're not really preparing for that anymore. Like we don't want to do that. So you don't see the further continuation of tanks in that regard. It just sort of becomes, what does the US think of tanks and where are they going to go with it? So again, by 1922, let's say, we have the Mark 8 heavy international tanks and we have the 1917 light tanks, but we don't have a proper medium tank. And this seemed to have really bothered the US military for some reason at the time, because pretty much all interest in light tanks and heavy tanks dies immediately. And in 1922, pretty much all the 1920s, the US is really only interested in pursuing a medium tank. Famously, we build the 1921, and then I think we evolve on it, and it becomes the 1928, the big medium tank. Like, we put all of our eggs into this basket. In fact, there's literally, I'll reference this in the STUART video, but there's literally a memo from Ordnance asking the Army, or asking Rock Island Arsenal to ask the Army what their requirements for a light tank should be, or to get started on a light tank. And Rock Island Arsenal replies and says they don't want a light tank. Like, we asked the Army what their light tank should be, and they set back, they don't want one. They said they would rather just have a medium tank, which is kind of really forward thinking, because as we know in World War II, the medium tank becomes king, like the Shermans and the Panzer IVs and the Panthers and the T-34s. So like, that's weirdly ahead of its time, but at the same time, it's like, you gotta have a light tank. Like, you can't just not build light tanks. So basically the light tank gets denied. And then in 1922, US Army Ordnance like orders, they send a note to infantry, and they order them. They say, give us specifications for a light tank. I don't care that you don't want one. Like, if you did want one, what would it look like? And infantry was like, okay, fine. And they gave them the specifications. And it was like, you know, under 13 tons. It had to have a 37 millimeter main gun and a coaxial machine gun operated by the same guy, 2-man crew. The specifications of a 1922, basically World War I, but 1922 era tank. And then a whole 5 years go by where just nothing is done with that. So 1927 rolls around and we finally get light tank T1, which is, for all intents and purposes, the first American, technically the second, but the first original American light tank design. Money is tight, like especially when World War I ends, you get the same thing that happens with World War II as well, where the war ends, and especially with World War I, nobody really expected the war to just be over. Like, the Allies were planning for these huge 1919 spring offensives and all that, right? Like, we were going to have the Pedersen device and tanks and planes and all this crazy stuff, and the BAR and like everything. And then the war just kind of ends. Funding and interest in all military development is just gone. I don't know about this for sure about like France and Britain, but I suspect it was the same way, because as far as I know, pretty much everyone came out of World War I broke as shit. And so like nobody really invested all that much into anything. But the United States in particular, just like, it really showed in that, like, we just didn't make that many tanks. Especially 1920, like, we basically didn't build anything. So instead, the focus is on the discussion of like, we know tanks, we have ideas, but we don't really know where any of this is going. And every single branch kind of has different thoughts on the matter, obviously. Like, the infantry obviously want tanks because the infantry still believe in the power of the individual infantryman, the soldier, this idea that they look back at World War I and they say, okay, and the chieftain talks about this. The chieftain talks about it, but then I also read it in the Ordnance journal, so like I know, like, this is what it was. They basically looked at World War I and divided it into two methods of warfare, artillery-centric and infantry-centric. And the United States basically concludes that the infantry-centric warfare was chosen to work, and artillery warfare was not chosen to work, which, and as the chieftain points out, is a little backwards, but that's what we came out with. Basically, all other arms of the Army are in support of the man on foot with a rifle. Like, he is the ultimate decider of the battle. Everything else should be there just to support him and to make sure he does what he needs to do. So that includes tanks. This is where we get the idea of the cult of the machine gun. The machine gun was king. The machine gun ruled the battlefield in World War I. The machine gun is the ultimate counter to infantry, but also the ultimate support of infantry. So for the US Army, like, that's where the cult of the machine gun comes from, is the machine gun is the ultimate weapon, essentially. And then also just the lack of development into proper anti-tank guns. Like, the M2 50 cal Browning is pretty much all we have. So in the 1920s and even way into the 30s. The cavalry are more interested, actually, first of all, they're really not that interested in tanks to begin with. Shout out that guy and his exhaust. The cavalry actually aren't all that interested in tanks at first, for really all the 1920s actually, because the cavalry just are not convinced that the tank can do the job of the horse as well as the horse can do. For the cavalry, their primary job is speed, flanking maneuvers, reconnaissance, shock attack, things like that. And especially in the 1920s, like, automotive technology is just not there. Like, tanks just can't go any faster than a man can walk. Yeah, they've got the cross-country capability, but also so do horses. Horses can swim through rivers. They can stomp over bogs and marshes. They can jump over fences. Like, horses kind of have this covered. So especially in the 1920s, the cavalry argument of tanks are not necessary because the horse can still do this job is actually totally valid. But the infantry are really interested in the protection that the tank offers. I remember reading an article from somebody, it may have been Gladian Barnes actually, I'll try to put it up if I have it, but he basically compares, like, he goes all the way back to the dawn of man. He's like, since the dawn of man, we've evolved our methods of movement, our methods of offense, and our methods of defense. He goes like, ever since a man picked up a club, he could attack. Ever since a man could run, he could move. Ever since a man wore armor, he could defend himself. And then he points to knights on horseback, and then firearms, and then the automobile. And now he points to tanks being this next evolution in this beautiful triangle of speed, mobility, and firepower. So for the infantry perspective, it's we can get mobile machine guns that can move anywhere, and they're protected. Like, for the infantry, it's like, this is awesome. Like, this is great. This is exactly what we want. But for the cavalry, it's like, no, this is stupid. This is dumb. And then the artillery basically just they don't really want tanks as much as they want artillery tractors, really. They just want like something with tracks that can like tow big, heavy artillery pieces. So the merits of the tank actually become somewhat of a fiercely debated topic in the United States, particularly within the cavalry. And there's a lot of office politics and gerrymandering and position holding that happens in the 1920s and 30s around the cavalry basically trying to hold on to their horses for as long as possible. Other branches know that the tank is inevitable. Like in all the ordnance journals that I've read, U.S. Army Ordnance seems pretty convinced from the beginning that the tank is the future. But no matter what, nobody can argue against the merits of the automobile. No doubt in anyone's mind that is where things are going. I mean, teleport yourself back to the 1920s and like, this is the dawn of the automobile. Like, just how, you know, living in the early 2000s, this was like the dawn of the age of the internet. And we all know, like, this is where it's going. What it's going to look like, we don't know, but like, we live in the information age today. Even back in the day, in the writings in the 1920s, they knew. They saw the writing and they were like, we are living in a new time. Like, we can see it, which I think is pretty cool. Like, to think that guys in the 1920s kind of knew that they were living inside of like an era of history that would change things forever. This is the 1920s, like, this is right smack in Henry Ford's reign. Like, this is when the automobile industry in the United States, in Detroit and beyond, like, was really getting off its feet, and the Army knew it. Like, Ordnance was writing, like, hey, like, we have an incredible automobile industry ripe for the taking, and we're kind of not doing anything with it. Like, this is a problem. But again, like, the money really is just not there. The interest in the automobile is there. The interest in tanks is, like, depending who you ask, is it there? Is it worth development and time? But beyond all of this, the money is just not there. And attempts are made, but they're kind of weak. The farthest we really get, and especially the farthest that the cavalry will let it go, is the motorization of logistics. And it leads to this really interesting sort of like backwards evolution of motorization and mechanization in the US Army, where in the late 1920s, we finally start to motorize, and we motorize the logistics first. So we actually, like, the first implementation of the automobile in the US Army, or some of the first implementations, are like logi trucks and hauling around trailers with machine shops on the back, and medical tent trailers, getting horses into horse-drawn trailers and trucks, hauling horses long distance and increasing the operational range of cavalry, fuel, ammunition transport, like troop transport, everything like that. Like, we motorize the logistics first, and then we'll worry about the combat motorization like later. It's oddly prophetic because obviously the US military in World War II becomes very well known for having incredible logistics. And I think both the National Defense Act of 1920 being focused on the industrialization of the military and creating that collaboration between the military and civilian industry, and then the motorization of the US Army in the late 20s, focusing on the logistics, those two things combined really are the blueprint and that we work on in the 1930s that lead to the US Army as it is in the late 30s and then into World War II, being this industrial logistical powerhouse. I think I'm about to run out of battery, so I'll replace this and we'll come back to this. I return with a new cup of hot chocolate as well, which I am spilling everywhere. Ooh, that is hot. I'm not gonna lie, I sort of forgot where I was, but I know we're creeping up on the end of the 1920s and the motorization of the U.S. Army and the cavalry and artillery and all that. So yeah, we're basically doing that. It's obviously such a fascinating time, especially the 1920s, because like we know that the motor is the future, but what does it look like? And you have people on both sides who are making pretty fierce arguments, both for and against the tank. But since it's the 1920s and the technology's not there, nobody really has any actual legs to stand on. And especially reading in the Ordnance journals, which for those who don't know, the Ordnance journals is like, literally if you're a member of U.S. Army Ordnance, it's like this, like the monthly subscription magazine basically that you get. A collection of all these articles written by like generals and guys in Ordnance at the time. And it's basically just a giant think tank of Ordnance at the time. And as far as I know, there's journals for the infantry, journals for the cavalry, like for all the branches. Obviously, the ones that I've been using for my research have been the journals of Ordnance. But it's so interesting to read all of these Ordnance journals of the 20s of all these guys. Like, there's guys on both sides of the spectrum. Like, there are guys who are saying the tank was a flash in the pan in World War I. It's not going to go anywhere. It was really useful in World War I, but again, we're not going to fight World War I ever again, hopefully. So, like, there's no need to dump all this money, time, and effort into developing them, because they just will never get any better. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who were like, eventually the tank's gonna replace literally everything. Like, the tank will become like the new way of fighting warfare. Like, they're gonna be wonder machines. So there's people on both sides of the spectrum. And then there are people in the middle. Like, I really recall being particularly moved by an article that General MacArthur wrote, although I think it was in like 1934, so a lot later. But General MacArthur like wrote an article that was then put in the Ordnance journals or republished in the Ordnance journals. And it was basically him saying, like, he recognized that tank life expectancy is going to get longer and longer, to where, like, a tank first may only last 5 years before it's outdated, it's superseded by something better. But then that tank will last 10 years before it's superseded by something better. And then that tank will last 15 years before it's superseded by something better. And, like, he correctly guessed. Like, right now, stuff is becoming obsolete very fast, but as the technology gets better, that won't be the case. By the time we get to the Cold War, like, the M60 is still a viable tank today. The T-55, in some cases, is still viable today. Like, the M1A2 Abrams made its debut in the 90s, and we're still using versions of it today. Like, he was just so spot on that. Like, he didn't even probably know at the time how spot on he was with that. But anyway, so the end of the 1920s, there's finally this centralized effort to motorize and to mechanize the combat arms. I believe it was Chaffee, I can put a correction, in 28 or 29 was tasked with creating an experimental mechanized force. At this time, in 1929, pretty much the only tanks we have are M1917s, which by the late 20s are horribly out of date. We have a bunch of World War I trucks, and the four produced T1 light tanks. So the most modern tank, basically, in U.S. inventory at the time, the T1 lights, and we only have 4 of them. And then, a couple thousand M1917s, which again, by this point are horribly out of date. So maneuvers are scheduled, training begins, and initially there's set to be this like grand war game involving this new experimental mechanized force, but it ends up going terribly because the force is just out of date. Actually, I should say, from 1928 to 1931, the T1 light tank is being developed a lot. A bunch of different versions are made. I'll cover all of them in the STUART video. But in 1931, in particular, 2 big tanks swing by Aberdeen Proving Grounds, essentially, and that is the Vickers 6-ton Mark E and Walter Christie's 1931 tank. Quite interestingly, both of these tanks make a huge splash. The United States actually purchases, or I should say, I don't know purchases, but borrows, I think. I think we purchased it, but we gave it back. We purchased one single Vickers 6-ton Mark E, simply for testing, like just for the U.S. to say, hey, like, this is a new tank from the British. People say it's really good. We're going to test it. And we test it, and it is incredible. Like, it passes the test with flying colors. Aberdeen Proving Grounds, I'm pretty sure word for word says that it is, quote, like the single best tank of the track laying type now known. This is genuinely the greatest tank in the world right now. So Aberdeen Proving Grounds is super impressed with the Vickers 6-ton, the Vickers E. Licensed production of the Vickers E in the US is taken seriously and goes up the chain of command before it's cut off, because the money wasn't there. They were like, we literally don't, like, we like this tank a lot. Like, as far as we're concerned, it's the greatest tank on this planet, but like, the money's just not there. So we instead have to go back to developing Light Tank T1. But then weirdly enough, Walter Christie makes his debut. Well, he doesn't make his debut. He was doing stuff all the way back in 1919 and 1918 with like wheeled artillery vehicles and stuff like that. And his tank design goes all the way back to 1928. But 1931 is when he drives it in front of Congress and stands on top of it and is like, I am literally God, buy my tank. And everyone goes, oh my God, that guy's literally God. We need to buy his tank. And he drives it from Fort Meade over to Gettysburg and back. He does his famous thing where he drives it on tracks and he clocks 40 miles an hour. He takes off the tracks, he drives back on wheels and he clocks 70 miles an hour, which granted, like, yeah, for 1931, like, that is fucking insane. I think what Walter J. Christie really did for the tank world is he finally showed that tanks can be fast. Like, they can go faster than walking speed. Because, like, the Vickers 6-ton, like, obviously it's a great tank, but that thing tops out at, like, what, 15, 20 miles an hour? I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure I'll fact check. But, you know, it's still within that realm. I mean, most people use it as an infantry tank of sorts. Especially the U.S. cavalry at the time, like I said, you know, for them, there's nothing that can do the job of a horse. Armored cars are cool because they can go fast, perform really good on roads. They can carry radios a lot better than horses can. The armored cars can move fast on roads and in good terrain, but then once the terrain gets tough, now the horses like have their role to fill. And then the argument is, well, if you want, you know, cross-country mobility, that's where the tank has you covered. But then the cavalry say, but we lose the speed. So the cavalry are really looking for that match made in heaven between the speed and strategic mobility of the armored car, but then the tactical mobility and cross-country capability of the horse. And so far, nothing had been able to do that until Walter Christie. Walter Christie comes in and he says, you take the tracks off, it's an armored car, you put the tracks on, it's a really fast tank. And finally, the cavalry can't deny it any longer, that the tank has finally reached a technical point where it's really worth considering. And of course, the army is just like, oh my God, like, this is like, holy shit, this opens so many doors. And quite famously, the debate whether or not to purchase Walter Christie's tanks goes all the way to Congress. There's a congressional hearing over how many tanks they should buy because the U.S. Army has been very stingy with its money. The tank gets so much press that Congress brings the Army in and says, why aren't we buying like 60 of these fucking things? And the Army's like, well, we don't want to. We'll buy one for testing. Well, you should buy like 7 of them because, like, why not? And, you know, get them into service. Like, let's start really using these things. But then the argument's like, nah, like, to test it, we really only need 1. So let's save our money and let's just buy 1. And they end up buying 7 of them. Which, looking back, it's an interesting thing that happened because you have the Vickers E, which turns up at Aberdeen Proving Grounds and is literally said in writing to be the greatest tank on planet Earth. And they say, we can't afford it. We're not even going to buy 1 to keep. They sent it back. The Vickers 6-ton that they tested at Aberdeen, once they were done with it, they returned it to Britain. So we didn't even keep it. And then Walter Christie comes in, and now all of a sudden there's a congressional hearing to buy 7 of them. And it's like, okay, well, we don't want to buy the 6-ton? Like, we literally said it was the greatest tank in the world. Like, what? But to be fair, I think it's undeniable that Walter Christie changed the tank game. Like, nobody thought about tanks the same after Christie, and his designs proliferated. The British bought them, turned them into cruiser tanks. The Russians bought them, turned them into BTs. The Polish bought his design notes and tried to make 10 TP. And the United States developed Christie tanks all the way into the late 30s. Like, his mark on tank history is undeniable, and like pretty much everyone in the world saw what he did and was like, whoa. Actually, except the Germans. The Germans really never paid much attention to it, although they had other things to worry about, I'm sure, at that time. In the early 30s, like, they barely had a functioning army, let alone any prestige position to pick and choose what tanks they got. So Christie really is, like, I think Christie is genuinely a huge turning point for the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. is going to test Christie tanks. We're going to build our own Christie tank because Christie turns out to be an asshole to work with. Nobody wants to work with him. So we kick him out of the projects and we buy the rights to his designs and we build our own Christie tanks. In the meantime, tank development continues. We get the T4 medium tank, and then Harry Knox comes in with VVSS, and we get essentially the evolution on the T-series light tanks and the Vickers mediums and all that, or the Vickers 6-tons. We get the evolutions of all those into what becomes combat car T2 or combat car. Oh shit! How does this go? I know it's medium or light tank T5. I'll have corrections for all the names. The names get really mixy, especially when you're trying to talk the same tank, but between cavalry and infantry, they're going to have different names. So it gets really confusing. But basically the Stuart, what ends up becoming Stuart, is finally brought in 1935. You have these big trials between the T4 combat car, or medium tank T4, and then the light tank T5 as the Harry Knox VVSS. They go head-to-head in 1935, and the T5 is chosen. And at that point, really, the rest is history. Stuart comes adopted. And I mentioned it in my M3 Lee video, but towards the end of the 30s, we're getting these war games. We're getting the Louisiana maneuvers, the Carolina maneuvers, and all these other big war games where the U.S. is saying, hey, like, we finally have modern tanks. Now we've got more stuff to build a modern mechanized fighting force. So, like, we're going to do more war games. And at that point, the cavalry dominate, particularly the 7th Cavalry Brigade does some really good work in those war games. And that's when Chaffee, Magruder, Brigadier General Frank Andrews, and I think it was Patton, they all go to General Marshall, George C. Marshall, and they advocate for the creation of an armored force. And again, the chieftain does a good job explaining this, but they wanted to keep the infantry and the cavalry out of it because they knew they were having this big beef over who should get tanks and what they should be. So they finally went to them and said, hey, look, 7th Cavalry, mechanized, attached to a proper infantry brigade, that's the template. That's what we should do. That's perfect. Let's take that template and let's create a new armored force. So now cavalry and infantry, neither of them have like ownership of tanks. Like now it's its own thing again, so they don't fight over it anymore. And we're not going to call it the tank force because that kind of has infantry ties. And we can't call it like the combat car force because that has cavalry ties. So we're going to call it armored force. Therefore, we're diverting it from both infantry and cavalry ownership. And the guys we're putting in charge, Leslie McNair and Barnes and all these guys, are artillerymen, so neutral players. And the creation of armored force, quite notably, did not have infantry or cavalry officers present. It was created behind both their backs. And that basically becomes the tank organization scheme for World War II. I mean, at this point, we're like, in my explanation in the timeline, at this point, this is like 1940, where this is happening. So like, World War II is like, knock, knock, it's here. France has fallen, now what? So, I mean, yeah, that's pretty much it. That is more or less the evolution of American tank forces from the 20s to 30s. Like, honestly, this is basically just a rehash of the Chieftain's video, but I would highly recommend watching his because he goes a lot more in depth. And this is kind of an entire chunk of my Stuart video script that I've taken out and just rambled to you about. So all of this will be said kind of again in the Stuart video, but also elaborated on and a lot more organized. But hopefully this acts as a nice little placeholder for you guys to keep you guys busy while I continue working on the Stuart video. And if you found this talk interesting and informative, to steal the Chieftain's tagline, then this will basically be the subject of the Stuart video, except we're going to go way more into the individual tank development and the mechanics of all the different light tanks that were developed at this time and all that fun stuff. So we're going to go even deeper. So if this talk was interesting to you, I think you're going to really like the Stuart video because it's basically this, but even deeper, even more. I don't know how long it's going to be, but it's going to be pretty awesome. And we're going to have footage from Fort Lee, and I'm going to be standing in front of all the tanks, and it's going to be great. Yeah, why didn't the U.S. build tanks in the 1920s? Money, interest, and the technology wasn't there. Why did they build more tanks in the 30s? Money came in, the technology caught up, so interest peaked. And then by the late 30s, the U.S. is scrambling to create armored force and industry, tank factories, everything, and then we just barely squeeze it in time for World War II. And again, actually, I highly recommend checking out my M3 Lee video because although that jumps into medium tanks, not light tanks, we cover the development of the M2. So we basically start off in like 1937, and then I go through the creation of armored force and the establishment of the American tank industry as well. So that all really goes into how the U.S. went from nothing to what it became in World War II as well. So honestly, the Stuart video, plus this ramble, plus the M3 Lee documentary, plus the Chieftain's 2-part series. Like, if you watch all that stuff, you're good. You pretty much got it, man. Go watch something else. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the merch store. I'm not wearing my merch right now, but we got t-shirts. Actually, we do have N320 mugs. This is not an N320 mug. I wish it was. I don't have one, actually. I should get one because they're pretty cool. Pillows, mugs, t-shirts, bags, like all sorts of stuff. You can get logos and everything. It's great. Check out merch. We've got, follow me on Instagram. I post on Instagram, like I said, and I give updates on what I'm doing. Reddit, we got a subreddit. Join the Discord. Become a patron. All the usual fun, pluggy plug stuff. And most of all, love tanks, because I sure do. And I think you should too, because they're pretty freaking cool. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks again for watching, and bye. Go away. Bye-bye, go away. Bye-bye, go away.